All right. Hi. Welcome to the presentation that is now going to be a 30-minute presentation because airports. My name is Dave Lewis. I'm a global advisory CISO for Cisco. I'm part of the Duo security team. And I'm here to talk about nothing to do with Duo security. So I'm here to talk about data breaches. And probably helps if I had actually turned on my clicker. Let's see if this is going to work. Boop. Yay. So I've been doing this for a very long time. And when I say this, I mean security in any shape or form. I have been at this for over 25 years, probably closer to 26 at this point. And along those lines, I have actually had the ability to have all sorts of jobs, from being a firewall admin all the way through to being a CISO for a power company. And along the ways, I've also suffered my share of data breaches. And it's really been an interesting adventure. So I identify myself as a hacker, and if you have a look around on Google, you'll find out that, yeah, people don't generally like hackers, but I get away with it because I'm Canadian, so. The easiest way to tell a Canadian, though, is we're usually dressed like a homicidal maniac going across a sheet of ice at a very high rate of speed. So, as I mentioned, I do work for Duo Security, which is now part of Cisco, but the reason I'm here is more to talk about data breaches. Now, apparently I have a very hard time sleeping, so what I did was that I went through and for 2016, 2017, and I'm now going through 2018's list of publicly available data breaches. And I went through them looking for commonalities, looking for anything I could do for trending analysis and things to that effect. The problem here is there was no common lingua franca between any of these. You would see all manner of things along the lines of, the laptop was stolen from the car, but it's okay because the Windows 98 laptop had a password. Yeah, not going to help you, to be entirely honest. And this is one of those things. So as I'm going through there, I realize that there's not enough coffee in the world when you're going through and reading all of these data breach reports. And when you're trying to get a thread out of all of this, and you realize very quickly that there is no commonality, there's no mutual understanding. And that's one of those things where we have to have that conversation. We have to go forward and say, how can we do this data breach reporting in a better way? And it is absolutely not to cast aspersions on anybody who gets breached. I've lived through it myself. I know how painful it is. It's more of the lessons learned. Because when something goes wrong, we can do a lot more value by understanding that and sharing it with other people. Now, one of the best data breaches I ever saw was from when I did my degree in classical studies and archaeology. That's how I actually got started before I ever hit into cybersecurity. There was one really interesting story that I took away from that. It was the sack of Rome in 410 AD. Now, in this case, what happened is the Visigoths came, they set up shop, they completely surrounded Rome, and they said nothing in or out. Within a few short weeks, the Romans had no food left. There were no supplies left. They threw open their doors. They've demonstrated in 410 AD that the idea of having a perimeter-based security model was fractured and broken. And I apologize to the cameraman because I do move around a lot and I can see that he's cursing me already. So data breaches nowadays are almost commonplace. We see these all the time. And we go back to 2005, there was the big case where 40 million credit cards were breached as part of a MasterCard data breach. And then again, we had the Heartland data breach in 2009. And I remember people talking breathlessly about these events, but these were events that we had no idea how bad it was going to get at the time. We really didn't appreciate the scope we were going to get to as we jump forward in future. And a lot of this was because of something like this, XP Command Shell. XP Command Shell, and I'm going to be really evil and come off the stage. XP Command Shell is actually a script that was built into a lot of databases. And this was something that was put there for reasonable idea of managing the database remotely. Unfortunately, when these databases were promoted into production environments, we had the problem of this still being enabled, and attackers were able to breach these databases and dump all of the information. It's a law of unintended consequences at its best. And the data breaches never seem to go away. Now, a quick show of hands with folks that were good enough to show up here. How many people here are familiar with S3 buckets on Amazon or AWS? Awesome. Okay, that's great. For those that you're not familiar, these are data repositories that you can spin up and you can put image files, you can put data files, whatever you happen to want. The thing is with these, by default, and I'll say that again, by default, these are set to private. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, we're seeing data breaches where their data was accessed by third parties because they left the door open. And this is not to cast a person on, this is just one example. And another example. And there are so many examples. This is not an example of the S3 bucket, but this is a point that it can happen to anyone. Now, it's really amazing that when you're looking at data breaches and understanding how these things happen, you really find that a lot of times you don't really internalize it until it happens to yourself. And I'll be honest, I was very much of that same sort of ilk. I didn't really fully appreciate the gravity of a data breach until I went through one myself. And we don't tend to really appreciate the data itself. And the reality is, when you look at stuff like an economist, data is very much seen as the new oil. It is the new currency of the day. I don't think you entirely agree with me based on your reaction, but this is one of those things where information is gold. And if we're not taking the time to better protect it, bad things can happen. And what slide presentation would be complete without the mandatory AI reference? But this has got a reason for this. Just before DEF CON a few years ago, I have the, how do I put it? I'm lucky enough to work on the DEF CON crew in Las Vegas, and we were trying to get set up, and this was a series of supercomputers that were set up across the stage as part of the DARPA Grand Challenge. The whole idea here is each one of these computer systems was trying to breach each other in an automated attack. The really amazing thing here was one of those systems that did win came up with a vulnerability and exploit that nobody had seen before. So it was actually able to create something on the fly. And then we think of the mandatory, oh yes, war games, but I won't let that go too long because somebody might have a seizure. But the attackers don't need to go to that extent at this point, because unfortunately, most of these data breaches happen because of weak credentials, because of patches that are missing. Lots of very simple things. And as I went through and I read all of these data breach reports, it was really amazing to see how many times 0-day was not mentioned. A lot of these data breaches were because of simple things that were missed, fundamentals that were overlooked. Why can't we do the basics well, as Quentin said yesterday? Now, Brian Krebs is not your IDF system, nor should he ever be. And these days, much more that reason. So this is an example here from Equifax when they had their data breach. Everybody was going on and on about the particular vulnerability that was exploited in order to get the data, but Brian did notice something here, that there was a web interface that could access the same data in 26 different countries with a default username and password. So the attackers are not going to burn a 0-day or something along those lines in order to get the data when they can just log in with admin and password. Why do we make it easier for the attackers? So when we're looking at media, we hear about unauthorized access, we hear about insider threats, we'll love to hammer away at that. Obviously the web breaches, but the one thing that usually doesn't get enough attention are the missing patches. Now, patching is not as simple as flip a button and you're on your way. If you're working in a shop with 10 users, obviously that's simple to do. But if you're working with a shop that is a scale of 20,000 or more, just patch it simply isn't something that's tenable. So you have to have better examples of how you're going to do this and better response plans, because the breaches obviously are going to happen. How many people here are familiar with the Star Wars movie Rogue One? Okay, for those of you who have not seen this movie, I'm sorry, there's some spoilers here, but this is a great data breach movie. So first of all, we have the firewall admin that's there protecting the planet. And he's saying, look, okay, I'm not really sure why you're here. You seem like a valid ship. I think I can let you in. But that's when the social engineering kicks in. And they say, oh, no, we're supposed to be here. We were rerouted. And they're like, okay, well, send your code. So away goes the SQL injection. And they're like, oh, yes, that's a good code. Okay, there's the breach. So the really funny thing is, when the attackers have then gained access into your environment, they very much want to do is an escalation of privilege. So they're looking for more data and what they can do to get away with and basically get away with things. But usually we don't know that we've been breached until much later. And this is one of those problems, is that the attackers know this and they do get away with this sort of things because by this point the data has already been accessed, or worse, the egress filtering has failed or is non-existent, and the data has already left your environment. But the best part of this movie was the lesson: encrypt your data. None of this particular data seemed to be encrypted. They didn't have to do anything here. But this is one of those things that, yes, humor there is there. Humor there is there. Humor is there. But these data breaches are real for us on planet Earth. So back in 2012, I started tracking data breaches because apparently I needed a hobby. And one of the really interesting ones here was LinkedIn. It was at 6.5 million records. And at that time, that was a huge, huge data breach. We flash forward today, we're looking at orders of magnitude of billions of records. And I'm worried that we're getting numb to it. Now, I've lived through my own data breach, and this is an example here of one company I was working at where root beer sec was good enough to pop a box that I thought was offline. So this was a system that was put out by our marketing team, and they had promised me they were going to take it offline. They did not. It got compromised, and next thing I know, the phone is ringing off the wall with various news organizations trying to buy, some 5 minutes with me to talk about it. This was not fun. This was very much a unfortunate feeling to have to go through, but it really hit home for me how much I should be, taking these things seriously. Now, this wasn't the marketing team's fault for not taking it offline. It was my fault for not following up with it. It was our team's fault for not making sure that we followed up with them to ensure that this box was going to be taken offline and not just taking their names at it or taking them at face value. And it's amazing where this is just a WordPress attack, but in my last job, we used to look at the different types of web attacks that were happening on a quarter-by-quarter basis. And this is an example from the data sets. And the reason I'm using this one without any date attached to it, because every single quarter, these were the prime attacks, and the numbers would vary by a percentage point here and there. Number one, SQL injection, local file inclusion, and cross-site scripting were always the top three. SQL injection, why? Because it works. Now, we as defenders have to do a far better job of sanitizing inputs and sanitizing outputs, and this will help for this go away. So here's a pop quiz. How many people here are familiar with the OWASP Top 10? Okay, who can tell me the first time that SQL injection was on the OWASP Top, or sorry, how long SQL injection has been on the OWASP Top 10? Ding, right from the very beginning. And here we are years later, I think it's what, 14 years later? We're still having these conversations, and we're still suffering through these sort of things. This is from a site called informationisbeautiful.net. It does data visualization, and they do it for data breaches. So this was a couple years ago. This is more recently. So much so that they actually had to change the way they did their data representation for this particular data set because it was just an absolute smudge. And it's amazing because it always feels like we are trying to get the data breach. It's almost like every organization out there wants to be breached. I know that's not genuine, but it's really how it feels. Because a lot of the times we're looking at security controls in all the wrong ways. And then Joe sneaks out of the room. Later, mate. But we're having conversations about vulnerabilities that we've known about for 10 plus years that are suddenly popping everything in sight. Why are we having these conversations about things that we've known about for a decade plus that have suddenly caused us all sorts of trouble? Why were these things not solved? This is a question we need to look and have an introspective discussion with ourselves. Anytime there's a data breach, there are costs involved. There is the cost of investigating the incident. You may want to bring in one of the shops out there that are going to go and say it was this particular evil empire over here, or whoever we're mad at this week. You want to look at the cost of remediating those findings. In one organization that I was at, where I was showing you that one particular data breach, we've had this whole list of remediation findings that had to be dealt with, and the person that was in charge of IT said, oh, we accept the risk. That did nothing to solve the problem. All of the issues that had been identified remained long after I left that company. What's the cost to recover? So if we look at, for example, Sony Pictures, when they had their data breach and they had their systems scrubbed right to bare metal, think about that if it happened to your organization today. How much money would it cost to rebuild to a point where you're now functional again? This is a real painful prospect. You gotta look at the cost of communication. How are you going to handle that data breach? If you are a publicly traded company, for example, you have a fiduciary responsibility to you can come in, I won't bite. Fiduciary responsibility to your shareholders as well as your customers to make sure that you are doing the best job at securing these things, and you need to communicate that message to external stakeholders, internal stakeholders, and there's a cost involved there. If you're doing a emergency PR group or your internal PR, whatever it happens to be, there is a cost involved. And then you have to look at the legal fees as well. There could be lawsuits. In a lot of cases, there are. And compliance penalties that could be leveraged. These are always fun. For anybody that has to deal with Europe, GDPR, I'm sure, has got you sleeping less at night. So another one, too, is loss of revenue. There are organizations out there, like one company that I worked at in particular, where the CEO sent out an email, and this email was not supposed to leave the company itself. This email said some negative financial information, and then within, it was roughly 7 seconds of that email going out, it had left the building 27 times. One of those times went to a reporter. The stock basically crashed 20% that day. These are things that are real. These are things that can happen. I know I've lived them. And also you want to worry about customer attrition and your stock valuation. The really interesting side note here is one of the side gigs that I have is I work with a boutique analyst firm called Securosis, and we did an analysis looking at how stocks performed after a data breach. The crazy thing was almost uniformly, their stocks went up. That is troubling. Maybe there is an incentive for people to get breached. Now the costs are also ones you may not have thought of. So for example, when Verizon was looking at buying Yahoo, Yahoo had not been forthright in disclosing a data breach that they had suffered years earlier. Once Verizon got wind of this, that cut $350 million US off the price. So there is a real financial point to be made there. Further to that, we look at the TalkTalk data breach, where this led to a £400,000 fine that was leveraged against the company. The person in charge of security at that, or it was the CIO or the it was the CIO, said, "Why do we have to do it? We are not legally mandated to encrypt the data." And I thought that was a bit of a misguided ideal. So when we look at Equifax, is a great lesson learned. With Equifax, that was very much in the public eye when they had their data breach. So who got fired? Well, the CISO, after 4 years with the company and made $11 million, retired. Actually, if you're a CISO and you can make $11 million in 4 years, I'd like to know where they work because I want that job. The CIO retired. And I'm sure the CEO was fine. Oh, wait, no. CEO retired with a $90 million US parachute. And in this whole thing, who did they blame? One guy in IT. This was indicative of a far deeper problem. You want to make sure that you are not looking for the one scapegoat. This was symptomatic of a much larger problem afoot with this particular organization. And hopefully this will stand out there as a lesson learned. Because look at it from your perspective of your organization. What if your entire C-suite was shown the door or retired suddenly? How would your company respond? And it was not just Equifax. Their competitor had a similar problem a few days later, where suddenly their TransUnion website was doing this. Installing malicious Flash packages. So attackers were good enough to mess with them as well. Now, when you're looking at doing security in your own organization, one of the things you want to do is you want to look for allies. There are teams out there that can help you get your job done. Compliance is a great example. The compliance team, which is one that I'll have to be purely honest, I used to deride myself, are a group of people that can very much help you build bridges within other parts of the organization. They can help you go through, excuse me, they can help validate your own plans. They can help you look at things from a different perspective that you may not have looked at before, because mistakes are going to happen in the strangest places. So when these mistakes happen, you want to make sure you have these allies. So this is a story where back in the 90s, I was working for a defense contractor in the United States, and it was odd that they let a Canadian in, but I was okay with it. I got really mad because the client site that I was working on was constantly being attacked by this one particular IP address. So one day after no sleep, because that's the way I did things back then, I went after them. I hacked back. So this is an example of why you should never hack back, especially when you're sleep deprived. When I went after this site, I got into their systems, I left a note for them because I wasn't going to tear everything down, and I said, look, these are the issues that I found with your particular site, and also I'd appreciate it if you would stop attacking our site, and I left a burner email address, and then I left. Feeling very proud of myself, I thought, okay, I've done a wonderful thing here. Yeah, a couple days later I got an email. They said, wow, thank you very much for the list of things that you found. We've been able to remediate that, and we really do appreciate it. But we just wanted to point out that you missed 1 octet in your IP address. It's like, what? I had, in fact, transposed a couple of numbers, and I had gone after somebody totally different, but they were appreciative, and that could have gone very much a different way. So here I am thinking that I'm hitting back against the attacker when inadvertently I had gone after some totally innocent third party. This is just a great example of why hackback never works, because mistakes are going to happen. And it's not just me. This was a great example here where I had a vulnerability scanning vendor who will remain nameless said, look, we're going to scan your entire IPA block. We'll give you a sample report so you can see how it is so you can buy our product. And I went, okay, full block, great. I was working for a power company at the time, and we dealt in Class Bs. So I said, yeah, here's our Class B. And they went, oh. We were kind of hoping for a Class C, and I'm like, oh, we don't do that. So I got this report a few days later, and they printed it. It was about this thick, and they said, here you go, and they were all very proud of themselves, and I'm flipping through it, and I'm looking at these things, I'm like, there's a lot of printers in here. There's a lot of printers in Shanghai, in Beijing, and I'm like, we don't have operations. Oh, no. They had done the same thing that I did years earlier. They had transposed 1 octet in the IP address space, and they had gone after an entire block in China. So I'm like, hey, congratulations, you've just committed an act of digital warfare. So they were really, really feeling bad about it and super apologetic, but I did learn very quickly that printers are a serious issue in China. But these mistakes are going to happen. And we have to learn how to take these as lessons and share them with others to make sure they don't do the same mistakes. And these lessons are many. This is a great example. I was working for a power company where they had this application that was promoted into production, and when they did this, they had bypassed security. We were the part of the gating process to make sure that it was vetted before an application was promoted into production. So this is not the actual website, this is just an example where I did view source. Right there, just so we make sure we're perfectly clear, this is how I looked at their web application, because this was the first thing I did when I finally got to look at it. This was the reaction of the application manager when I showed them what I found in the source code. And when I say source code, I mean HTML. Commented out in the HTML was admin and password. And I tried it, and it worked from their administrative page. I was able to gain full access. So we took that offline very quickly. Now, my first reaction was one of absolute disdain, but I made sure that I didn't blow my foot off, because this was an example where I had not taken the time to impart to them the security requirements that we had to make sure that an application was safe and secure before it went online. So this was a lesson learned for ourselves, where in order to avoid a data breach, we have to make sure that we're communicating this information forward. Because I really couldn't get mad at them because we never had that conversation. They did what they were good at, was writing an application, but at no point did anybody communicate that to them. Safely fix that one after the fact. But sometimes you'll fix things and you'll find out much later that, yeah, they didn't stay fixed. One company that I left, well, this happened. A coworker sent me an email and said, you're not going to believe this. Remember that server that you fixed before you left? I said, yeah. The one where we had 72 meetings in order to get it done? Yeah. Well, they re-enabled it. So this particular URL, if you put the, right at the end, /etc password, that was publicly available to anybody who wanted to look. This is a frustration that you have to be aware of, that even when you fix things, sometimes they'll get undone because people very often use tools and use things in a way that you just don't expect. or sometimes they'll ask for things that just don't work. Because these data breaches can happen literally to anyone. The first time I ever gave this talk, this particular company here, and this is not to disparage them, but this literally was an hour before I gave this talk the very first time, their entire database was dumped onto the site. My friend Bob Lord put it very well in that he described a data breach as going through a state of vertigo. And I agree with him completely. When I went through my own data breach, I didn't know if I was coming or going. I didn't sleep for several days. Now, the thing was, there was only 192 accounts on there. None of them are actually existing anywhere in our enterprise. It was only reputational risk, or reputational damage in that case. But still, it really, really stung. And mistakes will happen. The Morris worm is a great example. It was code that was released apparently accidentally. It was never supposed to do what the author had intended, yet it caused all sorts of damage. Now, as a security professional, we tend to look at everything as a tactical response. We are never really paying enough attention to the strategy. We tend to be very tactical. And we also tend to align against ourselves. And in many cases, we eat our own. So if somebody in the security profession does something wrong, we tend to gang up on them. And this is something we need to stop doing collectively, because we need allies. Another ally is the audit team within your own company. Now, I worked at one bank, and it was fantastic, and I say that very tongue-in-cheek. The audit team literally were trying to have, how'd they put it, my pelt on a wall. They wanted to tear me down because I was leading the security team, and they built out their metrics based on how many times they found something we did wrong. I made it my purpose to sit down with them and say, look, how do we make this so it's a mutually beneficial conversation? He was so caught off guard by this that he actually sat back in his chair and stared at me for a moment and then said, I had never thought of it that way. He had literally always thought of it as taking out my team. And I was like, this is not going to further the conversation. So we were able to sit down and have these sort of conversations, and he was able to help by testing our breach and incident response plan, which I'm sure everybody in this room has. Look at the risks and benefits of information sharing within our own organization, as well as other organizations that were in a similar market space. And, well, that compliance is often the adult in the room, but so is audit, which is a typo. Because when you're having these conversations and you have these allies within your own organization, you are better suited to give the bad news when it happens. Because the bad news is going to come eventually. And you have to really focus on not so much the 0-day, but the 100-day. My favorite example are SQL quarterly patch releases. Oracle patch releases that come out every quarter. And invariably, when I would speak to a DBA, I said, well, when's the last time you applied these? And he's like, oh, 2 years ago. And it's like, but what about the other ones? It's like, oh, it's okay, we have a firewall. I wish I was joking, but that's just it. It happens over and over again. It'll happen in your own organization. And I see some nodding heads. So what do? You've got to start where you are. You have to look at building out a risk register in order to understand what those risks are within your own organization. You have to be able to go through and say, these are the things that we need to address, and build out a mitigation plan for all of these. Because patching is not as simple as just flipping a switch and saying, okay, we're done. It really isn't. If you're in a 10-person shop, sure, that's manageable. But very much like Quentin mentioned yesterday during the CXO panel, if you're dealing with a shop of 20,000 or scaling above, it's not that easy. And we need to start looking at how we stop threats earlier. How do we protect using, making sure that we're looking at DNS as a great example. We're looking at how we're doing our patch cycle, how we're doing network zone segmentation within our own organization. One company I worked at years ago, I was able to sit at my desk in Toronto, and I could query directly systems in our offices in Malaysia, but there was nothing in between, and there was also no logging to show where I was coming from. We need to build out better security paradigms in order to make sure, did I just say paradigms? I'm going to go sit in my shame closet. We need to build out better structures because we're constantly being asked to innovate. And it's very difficult to innovate when the plane has already taken off, when you are trying to build that plane in flight. And things are going to happen, but these war stories are the ones you need to learn from. In one organization that I worked for, it was amazing. We had organizations in North America called RIA and MPAA that showed up, and they were very angry with us because we were downloading all sorts of movies and files, and they said, we're going to fine you if you don't fix this. And we said, what on earth are you talking about? And they showed us where they were allegedly being done, and we thought, this is very odd, because the information they had did not measure up with our office in Southeast Asia, and the logs simply didn't measure up. We had somebody local in the region who flew over to that particular country and had a look, and it found out that the folks in that office had built a stub network off the perimeter router. So, lesson learned on our part, we were looking at the firewall logs, but the router logs, apparently we weren't collecting at that particular location, so they had actually put a tap in between and created their own network, and they were downloading movies and files. So sometimes something that looks very bad can also be a great lesson, because you're able to take that and move on in a better way. Because these gotchas are going to happen in places you don't expect. In one power company I was working at, it was used to be part of one large company, but it had been split into 5 separate organizations. We had this weird routing error and nobody could understand it, so we went out and did what techies do. We went out onto the raised floor and we got the tile lifter, and tile number 1, no, nothing there. Tile number 2, no, nothing there. Tile number 3, oh, hey, hi. There was a Cisco 1750 blinking back at us from under the floor that nobody knew what it was doing there. Nobody understood what it was. After several hours of phone calls and doing all sorts of analysis, it turned out that that was actually a connection back to one of the other companies of the original 5 from back in the day when it was one whole company. Now, with that connection, that was something that was legitimate at one point in time, but now it was connected to what was ostensibly our competitor. Thankfully, they didn't know it was there either, so they were just as embarrassed as we were, and we were able to take that out before it was a real problem, but that's just it. These things are going to happen, so you have to make sure that you have a clear mitigation plan in place in order to address these things. And if you ever have trouble sleeping, go read some data breach disclosure notices. They will put you down. Thank you very much for... Hey, did it just die? It died. All right. Perfect timing. Thank you very much for your time today. If you have any questions, you can email me at gattaca, Gattaca, @duo.com, or conversely, you can find me at Twitter as @gattaca. And thank you very much for your time, and I greatly appreciate it.